Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the mighty Times Dominion's Wrath **. Through the massive viewing window, he could see the dark space ahead where the human territory began. Behind him stretched a fleet of 200 warships, each one armed with weapons that could destroy cities. The Zeltharian Empire had used these same ships to conquer 17 different worlds. Today would make it 18. The admiral was tall, even by Zeltharian standards. His blue-green skin bore the ritual scars of a career warrior, and his 4 eyes gleamed with confidence. He had never lost a battle. He had never even come close to losing. The humans would be just another easy victory. "Status report," he commanded. "All ships are in position, Admiral," replied his second-in-command, Captain Vorth. "We are 3 hours from the edge of human space. Our scouts report their border stations are active but poorly defended." Kethvar nodded. The intelligence reports on humans painted them as a young species, barely 500 years into space travel. They had only a few dozen worlds and primitive weapons. The Empire's war computers predicted total victory within 6 standard days. "Sir," the communications officer interrupted, "we're receiving transmissions from the human border stations." "What do they want?" Kethvar asked, not really caring about the answer. They're telling us to turn back, sir. They say we're approaching restricted space and should leave immediately." The bridge crew burst into laughter. Even Captain Vorth chuckled, shaking his head at the boldness of these primitives. "They think they can warn us away?" Kethvar said, grinning widely. "How amusing. What else do they say?" The communications officer listened to his equipment for a moment. They're repeating the same message over and over. They say this is their final warning, and that we should not enter their territory under any circumstances. Final warning? Kethvar laughed even harder. "These humans have courage. I'll give them that. Completely foolish courage, but courage nonetheless." The admiral moved to his command chair and activated the fleet-wide communications. Every captain in the armada would hear his words. "Attention, all ships of the Third Fleet," he began. "As you know, we are about to add another species to the Empire's collection. The humans ahead of us think they can frighten us with warnings and threats. They believe their primitive technology can stand against the might of the Zeltharian Empire." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around the bridge, his crew listened with eager anticipation. "I want all ships to ignore any further communications from human sources," he continued. "We will not dignify their pathetic attempts at diplomacy. We are here to conquer, not to negotiate. Prepare for standard invasion protocols." Throughout the fleet, weapons systems powered up. Shield generators hummed to life. The massive ships began to form, attack formations that had been perfected over centuries of conquest. "Admiral," the sensor operator called out, "we're detecting some unusual energy readings from deeper in the human system." Kethvar barely glanced at the sensor displays. "Probably their main defense fleet powering up. How many ships do our scans show?" "Known." "That's just it, sir. We're not detecting any ships, just energy patterns. They're spread throughout the entire system, but we can't identify the sources." "Primitive sensor technology," Kethvar dismissed. "They probably can't hide their power signatures properly. Don't worry about it." The fleet continued forward, cutting through space like a spear aimed at the heart of human civilization. The admiral had studied the intelligence reports thoroughly. Earth was their capital world, home to nearly 12 billion humans. Taking it would break their spirit completely. "Sir," the communications officer spoke up again, "the human transmissions are getting more urgent. They're now broadcasting on all frequencies." "What are they saying now?" Kethvar asked, only mildly curious. "The same message, but they're adding something new. They say they've activated their perimeter defense protocols and strongly advise us to retreat immediately." "Perimeter defense?" Captain Vorth looked puzzled. "Their border stations barely have any weapons. What kind of defense could they possibly activate? Cry. Kethvar studied the tactical displays showing human space. The intelligence was clear. Their border defenses consisted of a few small stations with basic energy weapons and missile launchers. Nothing that could threaten even a single Zeltharian cruiser, let alone a full battle fleet. They're bluffing, he declared. It's the oldest trick in warfare. When you're weak, try to convince your enemy that you're strong. The humans know they can't win, so they're hoping to scare us away. The sensor operator frowned at his instruments. Sir, those energy readings are getting stronger, and they're moving. Whatever's generating them is changing position. Automated defense platforms, most likely, Kethvar said. Probably trying to target our ships. Their targeting systems won't be able to lock onto us at this range anyway. As the fleet approached the border of human space, more warnings came through. Different voices, different accents, but all saying the same thing. Turn back, leave immediately, this is your last chance. They're really persistent, Captain Vorth observed. Some of these transmissions are coming from civilian stations. Even their non-military personnel are trying to warn us off. Fear makes people desperate, Kethvar replied. They know what's coming. They know their military can't protect them. So they're all doing whatever they can to try to save their pathetic lives. The Admiral looked out at the stars ahead. Soon, they would all belong to the Empire. The humans would join the ranks of conquered species, their worlds stripped of resources, their people enslaved or scattered. All ships, maintain course and speed, he ordered. Ignore all human communications. In exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes, we will cross into their territory and begin the conquest of humanity. The bridge crew cheered. Victory seemed certain. The Zeltharian Empire would soon claim its 18th species. But deep in human space, ancient systems that had waited centuries for activation began to stir. The warnings had not been bluffs or desperate attempts at diplomacy. They had been exactly what they claimed to be. Final chances to turn back before crossing a line that should never be crossed. The Empire was about to learn that some borders exist for very good reasons. The Times UES Defiant Times was not an impressive ship by any reasonable standard. It measured only 200 meters from nose to tail, barely large enough to house 50 crew members. Compared to the massive Zeltharian warships approaching human space, it looked like a child's toy floating in an ocean of giants. Captain Sarah Chen stood on her small bridge, watching the alien fleet through her ship's sensors. 200 enemy vessels, each one powerful enough to destroy entire cities. Any sane person would have felt terror looking at such overwhelming force. But Sarah Chen felt only calm determination. Distance to enemy fleet? She asked her tactical officer. 50,000 kilometers in closing, Captain. They're maintaining steady course and speed toward Perimeter Station 7. Sarah nodded. Perimeter Station 7 marked the official boundary of human space in this sector. According to every law and treaty that humans had ever written, crossing that line without permission was an act of war. Have they responded to our warnings? She asked. No, ma'am, replied her communications officer, Lieutenant Torres. They're not even acknowledging our transmissions. Complete radio silence from their side. Sarah had expected this. The intelligence reports on the Zeltharian Empire painted them as arrogant conquerors who had never met serious resistance. They probably thought humans were too primitive to be worth talking to. Open a channel to the lead ship, she ordered. Full broadcast power. Channel open, Captain. Sarah activated the universal translator that humanity had developed for first contact situations. The device would convert her words into mathematical concepts that any intelligent species could understand. Attention, Zeltharian Fleet. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earthship Times, Defiant Asterisk. You are approaching the sovereign territory of humanity without authorization. This is your final warning. Turn back now, or face the consequences of your actions. She paused, giving them time to respond. The bridge fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Everyone waited, hoping against hope that the aliens would see reason. Minutes passed. The alien fleet continued forward without slowing down. "Try again," Sarah ordered. "Different frequency." Lieutenant Torres adjusted his equipment and nodded. "Ready, Captain." "Zeltharian vessels, this is your last chance to avoid conflict. We do not wish to fight you, but we will defend our territory. Please acknowledge this transmission and state your intentions." Again, they waited. Again, silence was their only answer. "Captain," the tactical officer said quietly, "we're receiving a transmission from the alien fleet." "Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was deep and harsh, speaking heavily accented but understandable English. "Human vessel, you will surrender immediately. Lower your shields and prepare to be boarded. Your pathetic species is now part of the Zeltharian Empire." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this. Humanity had learned many lessons from the ruins they had found scattered across the galaxy. One of the most important lessons was that some fights couldn't be avoided. "This is Captain Chen. I cannot and will not surrender. You are invading our space illegally. Turn back now, or we will be forced to activate our defense protocols." The alien voice laughed. A sound like grinding metal. "One tiny ship against our mighty fleet? You humans are even more foolish than our intelligence suggested. We will destroy you quickly as an example to your people." Sarah looked around her bridge. Her crew was young, but they were well-trained and dedicated. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing they might not return home. "Lieutenant Torres," she said calmly, "send a message to Earth Command. Tell them the Zeltharian Empire has refused all diplomatic solutions and is proceeding with hostile intent." "Message sent, Captain." "Good. Now send one more transmission to the alien fleet. Make sure they understand what we're telling them." Torres nodded and opened the channel again. "Zeltharian fleet. This is Captain Sarah Chen. You have ignored multiple warnings and stated your intention to invade human space. According to the defense protocols established by the Terran Defense Force, I am now authorized to activate Perimeter Protocol 7. Sarah paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Around the galaxy, every spacefaring civilization had their own version of final defensive measures. Most were simple things: mines, automated weapons, emergency fleets. Humanity's version was different. "Be advised," she continued, "that Perimeter Protocol 7 will result in the complete neutralization of any hostile force that crosses our borders. This is not a threat. It is a statement of fact. You have 10 minutes to begin your withdrawal from human space." The response came quickly. "Human fool, we do not fear your primitive weapons. Begin your attack. Show us what your pathetic species can do against the might of the Empire." Sarah turned to her tactical officer. "Lieutenant Park, please confirm that all perimeter stations have received our activation codes." "Confirmed, Captain. All stations report ready status." "Deep Space Monitoring confirms Perimeter Protocol 7 is fully operational." "And the backup systems?" "Also confirmed operational, ma'am." "Everything is ready." Sarah walked to her command chair and sat down. She had hoped the aliens would listen to reason. She had hoped they would understand the warnings and turn back. But hope was a luxury that humanity had learned to live without. "All hands," she announced over the ship's intercom. "This is the captain. Perimeter Protocol 7 is now active. All crew members should secure themselves and prepare for defensive action." She looked at the main view screen, where the alien fleet continued its approach. The lead ships were now less than 30,000 kilometers from the border. In space terms, that was practically touching. "Captain," Lieutenant Torres said quietly, "the aliens are demanding our surrender again. They say they'll spare our lives if we cooperate." Sarah almost smiled. The Zeltharians still thought this was a conventional military engagement. They thought it would be ship against ship, weapon against weapon. They had no idea what they were really facing. "Tell them," she said clearly, "that they had their chance. Multiple chances. In fact, they chose not to take them." The alien fleet reached the 20,000-kilometer mark. Then 15,000. Then 10. "Captain," Lieutenant Park announced. "First alien vessels are crossing the perimeter line." Sarah Chen leaned back in her chair and watched the tactical display. The Zeltharians had made their choice. Now, they would live with the consequences. "Activate Protocol 7, she said quietly. Across the human system, ancient mechanisms that had waited patiently for centuries began to wake up. The warnings had been given. The chances had been offered. The aliens had chosen conquest over wisdom. Now they would discover why humanity had survived when so many other civilizations had fallen. They would learn that some borders were not defended by ships or weapons. Some borders were defended by much older and more terrible things. Admiral Kethvar felt the first tremor run through his flagship just as the lead elements of his fleet crossed into human space. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration in the deck plating that made his crew glance at each other with confusion. "Report," he barked, though he wasn't particularly concerned. Space combat always involves some turbulence when ships maneuvered at high speeds. "Unknown, sir," replied the sensor operator, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty. "We're detecting massive energy spikes throughout the system, but the sources they're not showing up as ships or stations." Kethvar moved to look at the sensor displays himself. What he saw made him frown. Energy readings were appearing everywhere, around asteroids, near gas giant moons, in seemingly empty space. The patterns made no sense according to standard military doctrine. "Could be sensor ghosts," Captain Vorth suggested. "Human technology might be interfering with our systems." Before anyone could respond, something impossible happened. Metal plates that had appeared to be natural rock shifted and revealed themselves as camouflaged hull plating. Within seconds, what had looked like a harmless space rock transformed into a massive weapons platform. "By the void," someone whispered on the bridge. The asteroid fortress was only the beginning. Throughout the system, similar transformations began occurring. Moons revealed themselves as hollow shells, containing weapon systems larger than most battleships. Gas giant rings that had appeared normal on long-range scans suddenly blazed with energy as hidden platforms came online. Even stranger, patches of empty space began to shimmer and distort as cloaked installations became visible. "How many?" Kethvar demanded. "How many platforms are there?" The sensor operator's hands shook as he worked his instruments. I can't get an accurate count, sir. They're everywhere. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. And they're all powering up weapons. This wasn't possible. The intelligence reports had said nothing about defenses like this. Human space was supposed to be lightly defended, protected only by a few patrol ships and basic orbital platforms. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a transmission from the human ship." "Put it through," Kethvar ordered, his confidence beginning to crack. Captain Chen's voice came through clearly. "Admiral Kethvar, this is your final opportunity to withdraw. What you're seeing now is only the outer layer of our defenses. Turn your ships around and leave, and no harm will come to you." "How do you know my name?" Kethvar demanded. "We've been monitoring your fleet since you entered this star system," Chen replied calmly. "We know everything about your ships, your weapons, your battle plans. We've been preparing for this moment for a very long time." The Admiral looked at his tactical displays again. The hidden platforms were still revealing themselves. And now he could see weapon systems unlike anything in the Empire's arsenal. Some appeared to be particle beam arrays large enough to crack planets. Others defied identification entirely. Strange geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "No species could build defenses like this without our intelligence services knowing about it." "We didn't build most of it," Chen answered. "We inherited it. And we've spent the last 3 centuries learning how to use it properly." "Inherited? What did that mean?" Kethvar was about to ask when his ship shuddered again, more violently this time. Emergency lights began flashing across the bridge. "Report!" he shouted. "Gravity fluctuations, sir," the navigator said, his voice tight with fear. "Something is manipulating local space-time. Our engines are having trouble maintaining course." Through the main view screen, Kethvar could see his fleet beginning to spread out in unnatural patterns. Ships that should have been flying in tight formation were drifting apart as invisible forces acted upon them. Some vessels were rotating slowly on their axes despite their pilots' best efforts to maintain control. "Weapons status," he ordered. "All systems ready, sir. But we can't get target locks. Every time we try to aim at one of their platforms, our targeting computers report impossible spatial distortions." The admiral clenched his fists. The Zeltharian Empire had conquered 17 worlds with superior firepower and tactical brilliance. Their enemies had always fought with conventional weapons, energy beams, missiles, kinetic projectiles. This was something entirely different. "Sir," the sensor operator called out. "One of their platforms is doing something. Energy readings are off the scale." On the main screen, one of the asteroid fortresses began to glow with an inner light. The glow spread across its surface in intricate patterns that reminded Kethvar of ancient circuit diagrams. As the light intensified, space itself began to bend around the installation. "What is that?" Captain Vorth asked. "Unknown technology," Chen's voice answered, though they hadn't asked her directly. "That particular installation manipulates fundamental forces. It can increase or decrease gravity, alter the flow of time, even change the basic properties of matter within a limited area." "That's impossible," Kethvar protested. "Those kinds of technologies are theoretical at best. No civilization has ever mastered them." "You're wrong," Chen replied. "Several civilizations have mastered them. Most of those civilizations are now extinct, which is why the galaxy looks so empty despite being so old. We found their ruins. We studied their mistakes. And we learned from them." The glowing asteroid suddenly pulsed, sending out a wave of distorted space that passed through part of the Zeltharian fleet. The ships caught in the wave didn't explode or burn. Instead, they simply stopped. Not stopped moving, stopped existing in normal time. They hung motionless in space like statues, their crews frozen in temporal stasis. 17 ships, Kethvar whispered, watching his vessels become decorations in the void. 17 ships. In one attack. "That was a demonstration," Chen said. "We wanted you to understand what you're facing. This isn't a war between 2 military forces. This is you walking into a carefully prepared trap that was designed by species far more advanced than either of ours." More platforms were activating now. Some projected fields that made space itself solid, creating invisible walls that his ships couldn't pass through. Others generated zones where the laws of physics seemed to break down entirely. And in the distance, larger installations were beginning to move, revealing themselves to be not platforms at all, but massive ships built into planetary bodies. "Why?" Kethvar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do humans have these weapons? Why would any species need defenses like this?" "Because we learned the most important lesson in galactic history," Chen answered. "The universe is old, Admiral. Very old. And it's full of the graves of civilizations that thought they were the strongest. We found those graves. We studied them. And we decided that humanity would never join them." The Admiral looked at his fleet, scattered and helpless among weapons that violated everything he understood about warfare. Half his ships were already disabled or destroyed. The rest were trapped in fields they couldn't escape or understand. This isn't a defensive system, he realized. This is a prison. Yes, Captain Chen agreed. The borders of human space aren't just lines on a map. They're the walls of a containment zone, designed to keep certain kinds of threats from spreading. Threats like aggressive civilizations that conquer other species. HFY finally understood. The warnings hadn't been diplomatic courtesy or desperate bluffs. They had been exactly what they claimed. Final opportunities to avoid triggering something that should never be awakened. We surrender, he said quietly. I'm sorry, Chen replied. But that's no longer an option. You've seen too much. Your empire would never stop trying to find ways around our defenses. The admiral closed his eyes as more platforms came online, their alien geometries casting impossible shadows across his dying fleet. The Zeltharian Empire had conquered 17 species. It would never conquer an 18th. Captain Zeftal of the Zeltharian Heavy Cruiser Times, Iron Dominance Times, was one of the first to realize that retreat was their only option. Unlike Admiral HFY, who remained paralyzed by the impossibility of what he was witnessing, Zeftal had the practical mind of a career survivor. All engines full reverse, he shouted to his crew. Emergency power to propulsion. Get us out of here. His ship, along with 37 others that had managed to avoid the initial wave of alien attacks, began turning away from the human border. They had seen enough. Whatever these humans really were, they weren't the primitive species the Empire had expected to conquer. For a brief moment, it seemed like escape might be possible. The Times, Iron Dominance Times, and its companions accelerated away from the nightmare zone where physics no longer worked properly. Behind them, they could still see ships frozen in time, vessels being crushed by impossible gravity fields, and weapons that made space itself burn. Distance from border? Zeftal asked his navigator. 50,000 kilometers and increasing, sir. We should be clear of their weapon range in another 10 minutes. Zeftal allowed himself a moment of relief. He would return to Empire space with news of this disaster. High Command would have to completely revise their approach to humanity. Perhaps they could negotiate, or find some way around these defenses, or simply avoid human space entirely. That was when his sensor operator made a sound that would haunt Zeftal for the rest of his very short life. Captain, the young officer whispered, something's following us. On the tactical display, new contacts were appearing. Ships unlike anything the Empire had ever encountered were emerging from what had seemed to be empty space. They weren't large. Most appeared to be roughly the size of destroyers or light cruisers. But they moved in ways that made Zeftal's experienced eye water with confusion. The human ships didn't follow normal space-time. They seemed to skip across distances, appearing in one location, and then suddenly being somewhere else entirely without any apparent travel time between points. Some moved in curves that bent back on themselves. Others appeared to be flying backwards, while somehow still gaining on the retreating Zeltharian vessels. How fast are they? Zeftal demanded. I can't calculate their speed, sir, the sensor operator replied, his voice cracking. They're not moving through space normally. It's like they're taking shortcuts that shouldn't exist. The human ships were beautiful in their strangeness. Their hulls appeared to be made of materials that shifted between solid matter and pure energy. Weapon ports opened and closed like living tissue. Most disturbing of all, each ship seemed to be surrounded by a field that made the stars behind it look wrong, as if the vessel was somehow existing in a slightly different version of reality. Open communications, Zeftal ordered. Maybe we can negotiate. I'm trying, sir. But they're not responding to any of our frequencies. The human ships drew closer, their impossible movements bringing them within weapons range of the fleeing Zeltharians. Zeftal braced for attack, expecting energy beams or missiles. Instead, something much stranger happened. One of the human vessels simply touched the Times Iron Dominance Times with what appeared to be a scanning beam. The beam felt gentle, almost curious. For a moment, Zeftal thought they might be trying to communicate. Then his ship began to come apart. Not exploding or burning, but actually dissolving at the molecular level. The hull plating started breaking down into its component atoms, which then separated further into individual particles. The process was completely silent and strangely beautiful. The massive warship simply faded away like morning mist. What are they doing to us? Someone screamed on the bridge. Zeftal watched his hands become transparent as the dissolution field reached the bridge. He could feel his consciousness remaining intact even as his body ceased to exist in any meaningful way. In those final moments, he understood with crystal clarity what was happening. The humans weren't just destroying the Zeltharian ships. They were unmaging them, taking them apart at the most fundamental level, and scattering the pieces across several dimensions simultaneously. It was the kind of technology that only made sense if you understood that reality itself was just another kind of engineering problem. Around him, the other retreating ships were meeting similar fates. Some were being consumed by what looked like controlled black holes. Others were being stretched across impossible distances until they snapped like rubber bands. A few simply winked out of existence as if they had never been built at all. But the strangest part wasn't the weapons themselves. It was the methodology. The human ships worked with the careful precision of gardeners pruning unwanted growth. There was no anger or hatred in their actions, no desire for revenge or conquest. They were simply removing a threat with the same calm efficiency that a surgeon might remove a tumor. "Sir," the communications officer managed to say before his vocal cords dissolved, "I'm picking up transmissions between the human ships." What are they saying?" "They're discussing our ship configurations. They're analyzing our technology and comparing it to previous encounters." "Captain, they're talking about us like we're specimens." Zeftal tried to laugh, but his lungs were no longer solid enough to produce sound. Specimens. Of course, the humans weren't fighting them as equals, or even as enemies. They were studying them as examples of a particular type of galactic threat. As the dissolution field reached his brain, Zeftal's last coherent thought was a realization that would have changed the entire course of galactic history if he had lived to share it. Humanity wasn't just another spacefaring civilization. They were something far older and more dangerous. They were the inheritors of technologies that previous galactic civilizations had created in their final, desperate moments. And they had learned to use those technologies, not for conquest, but for maintenance. They were the galaxy's immune system, designed to identify and eliminate threats before they could spread. The Zeltharian Empire hadn't encountered a primitive species ripe for conquest. They had stumbled into the carefully maintained border of something that viewed the entire galaxy as its responsibility to protect. One by one, the fleeing ships disappeared from existence. The human vessels completed their work with mechanical precision, ensuring that no trace of the invasion force survived. When the last Zeltharian warship had been unmade, the strange ships began returning to their hidden bases. Deep in the human system, automated systems updated their threat assessment databases. The Zeltharian Empire was now classified as a confirmed hostile civilization. Appropriate countermeasures would be prepared. But that was tomorrow's concern. Today's work was complete. The border had been tested, and it had held. The quarantine remained intact. In the vast emptiness where 200 warships had recently flown, space began to heal itself. Reality flowed back into the areas where it had been temporarily suspended. Within hours, there would be no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened here. The galaxy continued its ancient dance, unaware that it had just been saved from another potential catastrophe. And somewhere in the dark between stars, automated monitoring stations began watching for the next threat that would inevitably come. They always did. The Times Lucky Strike Times was the smallest ship in Admiral Kethvar's fleet, a tiny scout vessel designed for reconnaissance rather than combat. When the impossible weapons began firing, and reality started breaking down around the invasion force, its pilot, a young officer named Thek Moore, made the smartest decision of his life. He activated every stealth system his ship possessed and ran. While his fellow Zeltharians died in ways that violated the basic laws of physics, Thekmor pushed his little ship to its absolute limits. He flew through asteroid fields to mask his engine signature, used gravitational slings around planets to change course without using his drives, and generally did everything he could think of to avoid detection. For 6 terrifying days, he hid in the outer reaches of the human system, watching and waiting. He saw human patrol ships pass within kilometers of his position without detecting him. He witnessed strange vessels emerging from what looked like empty space to conduct mysterious operations. Most disturbing of all, he watched as reality itself seemed to be repaired in the areas where the battle had taken place. By the 7th day, space looked completely normal again. If Thekmor hadn't seen it himself, he never would have believed that 200 Zeltharian warships had ever been there at all. When he was finally confident that the immediate danger had passed, Thekmor began the long journey home. His ship's faster-than-light drive had been damaged in the initial chaos, forcing him to take several weeks to reach the edge of human space. Every moment of that journey, he expected to be discovered and destroyed. But the humans seemed content to let him go. Perhaps they wanted a survivor to carry news of what had happened, or perhaps they simply didn't consider one small scout ship worth the effort of hunting down. 3 months later, the Time's lucky strike times limped into a Zeltharian border station. Thekmor was immediately detained and brought before a military tribunal. His story was so outrageous that most of the senior officers assumed he had suffered a complete mental breakdown. "You're telling us," General Korthvek said slowly, "that the entire Third Fleet was destroyed by weapons that manipulate time and space?" "Yes, sir," Thekmor replied for the 100th time. "I have sensor recordings." "Sensor recordings can be faked," another general pointed out. "And you've already admitted that your equipment was damaged." Thekmor had expected this reaction. The Zeltharian military mind was not equipped to process what he had witnessed. Their entire worldview was built on the idea that superior firepower and tactical skill could overcome any obstacle. They couldn't accept that there might be technologies so advanced as to make conventional warfare meaningless. "Sir," he said desperately, "I understand how this sounds, but you have to believe me. The humans aren't what our intelligence reports claimed. They're something else entirely. Something dangerous." "Dangerous?" General Korthvex laughed. "One ship destroyed our entire fleet? A ship commanded by a female, no less?" "It wasn't just one ship, sir. It was their entire defensive system. The border itself is weaponized. And Captain Chen, she wasn't commanding that ship. She was just the messenger." The tribunal spent 3 days reviewing Thekmor's evidence and testimony. In the end, they concluded that he had indeed survived some kind of disaster, but that his account of events was obviously the result of trauma and imagination. The official report stated that the Third Fleet had been destroyed by a previously unknown superweapon, possibly a large space mine or experimental missile system. Preparations immediately began for a larger invasion force. If the humans had one secret weapon, the Empire would simply bring enough ships to overwhelm it. Thekmor tried to protest, but nobody listened to a junior officer who had clearly lost his mind. He was quietly transferred to a desk job on a remote station and ordered never to speak about his experiences again. But word had a way of spreading in military circles. Other pilots heard whispered versions of Thekmor's story. Engineers began asking questions about the technical specifications he had reported. Scientists started wondering about the implications of technology that could manipulate space-time. Within a year, those whispers had reached the highest levels of the Empire's government. Emperor Zalthkar himself finally demanded to review the complete, unedited records from the Time's Lucky Strike asterisk. What he saw in those recordings changed everything. The Emperor was no military strategist, but he was an intelligent ruler who had guided the Empire through decades of successful expansion. He understood technology, and he understood the difference between advanced weapons and impossible ones. The humans hadn't just defeated the Third Fleet. They had demonstrated capabilities that put them centuries ahead of anything in the known galaxy. "How many ships were we planning to send in the second wave?" he asked his military advisors. 500, Your Majesty," General Korthvex replied confidently. "With that force, we can overwhelm any defensive system. And if their defenses scale up proportionally? If they can do to 500 ships what they did to 200? Rublin," the general looked uncomfortable. "That's unlikely, Your Majesty. No species has unlimited resources. These humans appear to," the Emperor said quietly. "Look at these recordings again. Pay attention to the background energy readings. Their defensive platforms weren't even operating at full power. They were using a fraction of their capabilities." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If the humans had barely exerted themselves to destroy the Third Fleet, what could they do when seriously threatened? "Your Majesty," another advisor ventured, "perhaps we could negotiate. Offer them tributary status instead of conquest." Emperor Zalthkar shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't about our expansion plans anymore. This is about survival." He activated the room's main display, showing a map of known space with the Zeltharian Empire's territory marked in blue and human space marked in red. "Look at the location of human space," he said. "They're positioned along one of the main galactic trade routes. Any expanding civilization would eventually encounter them. And based on what we've seen, they don't negotiate with aggressive species." "What are you saying, Your Majesty?" "I'm saying that the humans aren't just defending their territory. They're maintaining a quarantine. They're keeping certain kinds of civilizations from spreading too far." The Emperor touched a control, and the display changed to show the locations of dead civilizations that the Empire had encountered over the centuries. Ancient ruins, abandoned worlds, the remains of species that had vanished long before the Zeltharians had achieved spaceflight. "We always wondered what happened to them," he continued. "Now we know. They encountered the humans. Within days, new orders went out to every Zeltharian military unit in the galaxy. Human space was to be marked as absolutely forbidden territory. No ships were to approach within 50 light-years of their borders. Any vessel that detected human technology was to immediately retreat and report its findings to High Command. The planned second invasion was quietly cancelled. The shipyards that had been building vessels for the assault were retasked to constructing defensive platforms around Zeltharian worlds. Because Emperor Zalthkar had realized something that his generals couldn't grasp. The humans had let Thekmor escape on purpose. They had wanted the Empire to know exactly what would happen to any future invasion attempts. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The message was clear. Stay within your current borders, stop expanding, and you can continue to exist. Cross the line, and your civilization will be quietly removed from the galaxy. The Zeltharian Empire, for the first time in its history, chose wisdom over conquest. In the years that followed, other aggressive civilizations would encounter the same choice. Most would make the same decision as the Zeltharians. Those that didn't would simply disappear, leaving behind only ruins and legends about the guardians who watched the spaces between the stars.